The winter of 1950 descended on the Korean peninsula with a fury that soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, turning the mountainous terrain into a frozen hell, where frostbite killed as efficiently as bullets. Among the troops retreating south from the Chosin Reservoir were thousands of young faces, boys barely into their teens, who had been conscripted into the South Korean army with little training and even less preparation for what awaited them. They wore uniforms too large for their small frames, carried rifles they could barely lift, and marched alongside men twice their age. When Chinese forces surrounded them in the valleys and mountain passes, these children faced a choice that no child should ever confront: fight to the death or surrender and face an unknown fate as prisoners of war. The Korean War, which began on June 25, 1950, created a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Within months, the entire peninsula became a battlefield where hundreds of thousands died and millions were displaced. Among the least remembered victims were the children, those who lost everything and those who were forced to become soldiers before they were old enough to shave. South Korea, desperate for manpower as North Korean forces swept south, began conscripting boys as young as 14. The official records would later acknowledge over 30,000 child soldiers, though the true number was likely much higher. Many lied about their ages, adding years to avoid being turned away, desperate to contribute to the defense of their homeland, or simply to receive the rice rations that came with military service. The recruitment was often brutal in its simplicity. Officers moved through refugee camps and destroyed villages, gathering any boy who looked old enough to hold a rifle. Some volunteered, driven by patriotism or the desire for revenge after watching family members killed by invading forces. Others were simply rounded up, given minimal training, and sent to the front lines within weeks. The training itself was a dark comedy of inadequacy. Boys who had never fired a gun were given a few days of instruction before being handed weapons and ammunition. They learned to march, to salute, to follow orders, but they did not learn how to survive the horrors that awaited them in combat. Park Min-soo was 14 years old when he was conscripted in the autumn of 1950. He had been living in a refugee camp after his village was destroyed, his parents killed in the initial invasion. When the army recruiters came through, he saw an opportunity. The army meant food, clothing, and purpose. He told them he was 17, puffing out his chest and standing as tall as he could. They barely looked at him before nodding him through. Within 2 weeks, he was on the front lines, shivering in a frozen foxhole, watching older soldiers die around him. He had thought war would make him a man. Instead, it made him understand how terrifyingly fragile life could be. The Chinese intervention in late November 1950 changed everything. What had seemed like an approaching victory for UN forces suddenly became a desperate fight for survival as hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border. The child soldiers, already struggling with inadequate equipment and training, found themselves caught in a nightmare beyond comprehension. The Chinese forces, well-trained and numerous, overwhelmed defensive positions with human wave attacks that continued day and night. The young Korean soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat before, broke under the assault. Some fought with desperate courage. Others froze in terror. Many simply ran, joining the chaotic retreat south. Those who were captured faced a journey into darkness, that would test every fragment of their will to survive. The initial moments of capture were often chaotic and terrifying. Chinese soldiers, sometimes as young as the Koreans they captured, herded prisoners into groups at gunpoint. Some captives were beaten, others stripped of warm clothing despite the freezing temperatures. The young Korean soldiers, still in shock from combat and capture, struggled to comprehend what was happening. They had been told that capture meant death, that the enemy showed no mercy. Now they stood shivering in the snow, surrounded by armed guards, wondering if execution would come in the next moment or the next hour. The death marches began almost immediately. Prisoners were forced to walk north, away from the front lines, deeper into North Korean territory, and eventually into China itself. They walked through mountain passes in sub-zero temperatures, wearing whatever clothing they had been captured in, which was rarely adequate for the conditions. The cold was a constant enemy, perhaps worse than the guards. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, then entire hands and feet. Men collapsed from exhaustion and hypothermia, and those who could not continue were often shot where they fell or simply left to freeze to death by the side of the road. Park Min-soo watched boys younger than himself die on those marches. He saw a 13-year-old from his unit, a boy who had lied about his age just as Park had, collapse in the snow and never rise again. The guards did not even pause. The column simply walked around the body and continued. Park learned to keep moving no matter what, to ignore the pain in his frozen feet, the hunger that gnawed constantly, the thirst that was worse than hunger. He learned that survival meant shutting down parts of yourself, becoming something less than human, a machine focused solely on the next step and the step after that. The permanent camps along the Yalu River became visible after weeks of marching, though calling them camps dignified them beyond recognition. They were collections of crude huts and shelters, offering minimal protection from the elements. Thousands of prisoners from multiple nations, Americans, British, Turks, and Koreans, were crowded into spaces designed to hold a fraction of that number. The young Korean prisoners found themselves in a strange limbo. They were prisoners of war, yet their own countrymen from the north sometimes served as guards or interrogators. The ideological divide that had split the peninsula now played out in miniature within the camps, creating tensions and dangers beyond those imposed by Chinese captors. Camp 5, which opened in January 1951, became home to thousands of prisoners, including many of the child soldiers. The camp sat near the town of Pyeongtaung, on the south bank of the Yalu River that formed the border with China. The location was strategic, far from UN lines, making escape nearly impossible. The conditions were deliberately harsh, designed to break prisoners physically and mentally. Shelter consisted of mud huts with leaking roofs and earthen floors. In winter, prisoners huddled together for warmth, but the cold penetrated everything. In summer, the same huts became ovens, and diseases spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions. Food was a weapon of control. The Chinese and North Korean guards used rations to reward compliance and punish resistance. The standard diet consisted of a small amount of cracked corn, millet, or sorghum, sometimes supplemented with watery soup. It was never enough. Prisoners lost weight rapidly, their bodies consuming themselves. For the child soldiers, whose bodies were still growing, the malnutrition was particularly devastating. They watched their own bodies waste away, ribs becoming visible, faces becoming skeletal, all signs of youth disappearing as starvation aged them prematurely. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical conditions. Political officers conducted constant indoctrination sessions, forcing prisoners to attend lectures on communist ideology and the evils of capitalism and imperialism. Those who resisted or showed defiance faced punishment, ranging from reduced rations to torture. The young Korean prisoners were particular targets for conversion. The communists saw them as malleable, young enough to be re-educated, and valuable as propaganda tools. They were separated from other prisoners, given special attention by political officers who alternated between promises and threats. Park Min-soo attended the indoctrination sessions because refusing meant starvation. He sat with dozens of other young Koreans, listening to lectures about the glorious future of communism and the corruption of the South Korean government. Some of his fellow prisoners seemed to absorb the message, nodding along, participating in discussions. Park never knew if they truly believed or were simply better actors than he was. He learned to keep his face neutral, to say the expected words when called upon, while keeping his true thoughts buried deep where no interrogator could reach them. Disease killed more prisoners than any other cause. Dysentery swept through the camps in waves, turning the primitive latrines into scenes of horror. Pneumonia claimed those weakened by malnutrition and exposure. Beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiency, made limbs swell and hearts fail. The camp hospitals, if they could be called that, were collection points for the dying. Medical supplies were non-existent. Doctors among the prisoners did what they could with nothing, but mostly they watched helplessly as men and boys died from conditions that would have been easily treatable in any proper hospital. The young Korean prisoners died in disproportionate numbers. Their bodies, still developing, could not withstand the combination of starvation, disease, and cold, as well as adult prisoners. Boys who had been conscripted in the autumn were dead by spring. Some lasted longer, surviving through luck or extraordinary constitution, but the mortality rate among the youngest was devastating. The survivors watched their friends and compatriots die, sometimes multiple deaths in a single day, until death became so common it lost its power to shock. Yet even in this hell, humanity persisted. Prisoners formed bonds that transcended nationality and age. American POWs, themselves suffering terribly, often shared what little they had with the young Korean prisoners. British soldiers showed the boys how to fashion crude insulation from scraps of cloth and paper. Turkish prisoners, known for their toughness and solidarity, adopted some of the youngest Koreans into their groups, protecting them from bullies and sharing food. These acts of kindness, small and often inadequate, made the difference between survival and death for some. The older Korean prisoners became father figures to the children among them. Men who had lost their own sons in the war found purpose in protecting boys who reminded them of what they had lost. They taught survival strategies, how to stay warm, how to make a little food last longer, how to avoid attracting the guards' attention. They shared stories and memories, keeping alive the world that existed beyond the wire, reminding the boys that humanity and home still existed somewhere, even if it seemed impossibly distant. Communication with the outside world was nearly non-existent. Letters from home rarely arrived, and those that did were heavily censored. The young prisoners wrote letters they knew would likely never be delivered, pouring out their fears and hopes onto scraps of paper. Some wrote to parents they knew were probably dead, needing to believe that someone, somewhere, cared about their fate. Others wrote to siblings or friends, describing their conditions in carefully coded language designed to bypass censors. Most of these letters disappeared into the bureaucratic void, never reaching their intended recipients. The psychological impact of captivity on children was profound and lasting. These were boys at an age when they should have been discovering who they were, forming identities, learning to navigate the world. Instead, they learned about cruelty, death, and the limits of human endurance. They saw things no child should see, experienced deprivations no child should endure. The trauma burrowed deep into their psyches, creating wounds that would never fully heal. Some retreated into themselves, becoming silent and withdrawn. Others became hard and cynical. Their innocence burned away completely. Park Min-soo celebrated his 15th birthday in the camp, though celebrated is hardly the word. He marked the passage of time on a makeshift calendar scratched into the wall of his hut. Another prisoner, an American who had somehow learned it was Park's birthday, gave him an extra portion of his own ration. It was a gesture so kind, so unexpected, that Park wept for the first time since his capture. He had thought he had forgotten how to cry, that the tears had frozen inside him along with everything else. But that small act of humanity cracked something open, reminding him that kindness still existed in the world. The winter of 1951 was particularly brutal. Temperatures dropped even lower than the previous year, and the camp became a frozen wasteland of suffering. Prisoners burned anything combustible to create tiny fires for warmth, but fuel was scarce and carefully controlled by guards. Men huddled together in tight groups, sharing body heat, but still they froze. The young Korean prisoners, smaller and with less body mass, suffered terribly. Some woke in the morning to find the person next to them had frozen to death during the night, their bodies stiff and cold. They learned to check for signs of life before trying to wake someone, learned to recognize the particular stillness of death. As the war dragged on and armistice negotiations began, conditions in the camps became slightly less harsh. The Chinese, aware that the world was watching, made some improvements. Rations increased marginally. Medical supplies arrived occasionally. The political indoctrination intensified, but the outright brutality decreased. For the prisoners, these changes meant the difference between certain death and possible survival. The mortality rate dropped, though disease and malnutrition continued to kill. The question of repatriation became a source of intense anxiety and hope. Prisoners learned through whispered rumors that negotiations were underway for an exchange. Some would be returned home, but who would be chosen? And what would happen to those who remained? For the young Korean prisoners, the situation was complicated by the fact that the peninsula remained divided. Which Korea would they return to? The South, which had conscripted them and sent them to war as children? Or the North, whose political officers had spent months trying to convert them to communism? Operation Little Switch in April 1953 brought the first exchanges of sick and wounded prisoners. The young Korean POWs watched as the seriously ill and injured were processed and prepared for transport. Some of the child soldiers qualified, their bodies so damaged by malnutrition and disease that they were classified as permanently disabled. Park Min-soo was among those selected, his frostbite-damaged feet and chronic dysentery making him eligible. The moment when he realized he was going home was surreal. He had spent so long assuming he would die in the camp that the possibility of survival had become abstract, a fantasy rather than a reality. The journey south to the exchange point at Panmunjom was carefully orchestrated. Prisoners were loaded onto trucks and trains, always under guard, moving slowly toward freedom. For many, the journey felt dreamlike, unreal. They had spent so long in captivity that the world beyond the wire had become mythical. Now they were re-entering it. But they were not the same people who had been captured. The boys had become old men in young bodies, their eyes carrying knowledge that should have come decades later, if at all. The actual moment of exchange was overwhelming. Prisoners walked across a line in the road, from Chinese and North Korean control to UN control, from captivity to freedom. Medics rushed forward, offering food, water, medical care. American soldiers looked at the skeletal figures emerging from the north with shock and horror, unable to comprehend the level of suffering these people had endured. The young Korean POWs, seeing their own people again, seeing South Korean soldiers and civilians, broke down in tears. Some collapsed, their bodies finally giving out now that survival was no longer necessary. Park Min-soo crossed the line on April 22, 1953. He was 15 years old. He had been a prisoner for nearly 2.5 years. He weighed less than 80 pounds, 40 pounds less than when he had been captured. His feet were permanently damaged from frostbite, and he would limp for the rest of his life. But he was alive. Against all odds, despite everything, he had survived. As he crossed into freedom, he thought of all the boys who had not, whose bodies lay in shallow graves near the camp or had simply disappeared into the frozen landscape. He carried their names in his heart, a weight heavier than any physical burden. The repatriation did not mean the end of suffering. The young Korean POWs faced a society that did not know what to do with them. South Korea in 1953 was a devastated nation, focused on survival and rebuilding. Resources for veterans were minimal, and for child soldiers who had been captured, there was even less. Many received no recognition for their service or their suffering. They were embarrassing reminders of the war's cost. Children who should never have been soldiers. Prisoners who had lived when so many others had died. Medical care was inadequate to address the complex physical and psychological damage these boys carried. Physical wounds could be seen and treated, though often poorly. But the psychological trauma, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the inability to trust or connect with others, these remained invisible and untreated. Many of the young POWs struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. They had missed crucial years of education and development. They had been through experiences that set them apart from everyone their age. They felt like ghosts, present but not really part of the world around them. Some of the former child POWs tried to return to school, sitting in classrooms with children years younger, trying to learn mathematics and literature while their minds replayed scenes of death and suffering. Others gave up on education entirely, finding work as laborers or in factories, their bodies damaged but still capable of manual work. A few, a very few, found ways to channel their experiences into something productive, becoming advocates for veterans' rights or educators who taught younger generations about the war's true cost. Park Min-soo struggled for decades with what he had experienced. He had nightmares about the camp until he was an old man. He could never be in enclosed spaces without feeling panic. He hoarded food compulsively, unable to shake the fear that starvation was always one missed meal away. He married and had children, but he never spoke to them about what he had endured. How could he explain to his sons and daughters what it meant to watch children die of starvation, to be so hungry you considered eating anything, to be so cold you thought you might never be warm again? It was only in old age, as South Korea began to finally acknowledge the child soldiers who had fought in the war, that some of the former POWs began to share their stories. Historians and journalists sought them out, recording testimonies before the generation disappeared entirely. Park, in his 70s, finally agreed to speak publicly about his experiences. He found that telling the story was both painful and liberating. For decades he had carried the weight alone. Now, at last, others would know what he and thousands of other boys had endured. The official recognition came far too late for most. In 2020, 70 years after the war began, South Korea formally acknowledged the child soldiers, but by then the majority had died. Of the estimated 30,000 boys who had been conscripted, fewer than 500 were still alive. Of those who had been captured and survived the POW camps, perhaps a few dozen remained. They had lived full lives, raised families, contributed to the remarkable reconstruction and development of South Korea. But they had done so while carrying invisible wounds that never healed, memories that never faded. The story of the Korean child POWs is one that history largely forgot, overshadowed by larger narratives of the Korean War, by Cold War politics, by the experiences of American and UN POWs. These boys slipped through the cracks of memory. They were too young to have been soldiers, yet they fought. They were too young to survive what they endured, yet some did. They deserved recognition and care, yet received neither for most of their lives. Their sacrifice was real, their suffering immense, their courage extraordinary. Yet for decades, almost no one knew their names or their stories. The camps where they were held have long since been dismantled or transformed. The Yalu River still flows along the border between China and North Korea, but the huts and buildings where thousands suffered and died are gone. Only photographs and testimonies remain, along with the memories of the few survivors. The landscape has healed in ways that the men who lived through those experiences never fully could. The mountain passes where death marches occurred are now quiet and peaceful. The frozen valleys where boys in oversized uniforms fought and died are now farmland and forests. For those who survived the experience, the camps remained forever present. They appeared in dreams and flashbacks, triggered by cold weather, by hunger, by sudden loud noises. The psychological scars proved more lasting than the physical ones, though those too persisted. Men in their 80s still bore the marks of frostbite, still walked with limps from untreated injuries, still bore the physical evidence of their stolen childhoods. But it was the invisible damage that cut deepest, the parts of their souls that had been frozen in those camps and never fully thawed. The few remaining survivors gather occasionally at memorials and ceremonies. Old men with white hair and weathered faces, wearing suits decorated with medals that came decades too late. They stand together, bound by experiences that no one else can truly understand. A brotherhood forged in the worst circumstances imaginable. They remember friends who did not survive, boys whose names are inscribed on memorials, but whose stories died with them. They remember the cold, the hunger, the fear. But they also remember acts of kindness, moments of humanity, the small victories of survival against impossible odds. When Park Min-soo finally told his story in detail, in his 70s, he spoke about the importance of remembering, not for glory or recognition, though both were overdue, but because the boys who died deserved to be more than statistics. They had names, families, dreams. They had been forced into adult situations while still children, asked to make choices no child should face, and many had paid the ultimate price. Their stories needed to be told so that future generations would understand the true cost of war, the way it devours innocence and destroys lives long before those lives have had a chance to fully begin. The legacy of the Korean child, POWs, is one of resilience and tragedy intertwined. They showed that even children possess reserves of strength and courage beyond imagination when survival demands it. They demonstrated that humanity can persist even in the most dehumanizing conditions. But their story also serves as a warning about the price of war, about what happens when societies are so desperate they send children to fight, about the long-term costs that extend far beyond the battlefield and the camp. The boys who entered those camps emerged as old men, their childhood stolen, their innocences destroyed, their futures forever shaped by experiences that should never have been. Today, as the last survivors age and their numbers dwindle, there is an urgency to preserving their testimonies. Each death means another voice silenced, another story lost. Historians and filmmakers rush to record interviews, to document experiences before they disappear entirely. The former child POWs, once reluctant to speak, now understand that they carry responsibility to those who did not survive. By telling their stories, they ensure that the boys who died in the camps are not forgotten, that their brief lives are remembered, that the injustice of forcing children to become soldiers and prisoners of war is never repeated. The children who became soldiers, who became prisoners of war in Korea, carry a triple burden: the trauma of combat, the horror of captivity, and the invisibility of being forgotten by history. They were children who had to become men too quickly, who saw and endured things that would break most adults, who survived when survival seemed impossible. They returned home to a country that did not acknowledge them, lived full lives while carrying unbearable memories, and grew old waiting for recognition that came too late for most. Their story is one that demands to be told and remembered, a testament to both human resilience and the terrible costs of war on those least equipped to bear them.